History does not bend to hope, and neither did the snipers waiting in the shadows. On April 5th, 1992, the first shot rang out, then another. In an instant, the largest peace demonstration in Sarajevo's history became its first battlefield. A young woman, marching for unity, fell dead on the bridge and the war had begun. It would last for over 4 years, shattering lives and forcing over 2 million people from their homes. But for some, war was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. A young man from Sweden, obsessed with violence and Nazi ideology, saw the bloodshed in Bosnia as his chance to fulfill a dark fantasy. His name was Jackie Arklov, and his path would lead from the killing fields of the Balkans to one of the most cold-blooded crimes in Sweden's history. Welcome back to the Midnight Docket. Tonight's episode is quite different from our regular routine. Our story will cover a war, extremism, a bank robbery, and a double murder. In order to try and make sense of a senseless crime, we must first try to make sense of a senseless man. To do that, we need to understand the world and time he was living in. We better get going. This is the twisted story of Jackie Arklov. The war in Bosnia began with a peace demonstration. The demonstration was not planned. It started as a spontaneous gathering on the morning of April 5th in the western parts of Sarajevo. The day before, Bosnia's political leadership had announced a general mobilization, and concerned Sarajevo residents, all of whom had heard the news, gathered to discuss the situation. Someone suggested a peace demonstration, and soon, a small group was on its way to the Parliament building. More and more of the city's residents joined in, and within a short time, the march grew from a few dozen to tens of thousands of participants. Soon, Sarajevo's streets were filled with massive crowds in what was possibly the largest demonstration since the city was founded in the 15th century. Nearly 100,000 of the city's 500,000 residents took part. We still believed there was a chance to change people's minds, to save Sarajevo and Bosnia as a place where Muslims, Serbs and Croats could continue living together, as they had for 500 years, recalls Samir Koric, a 27-year-old accountant who joined the march with several friends. His sentiment was not unique. Although bloody battles had been raging in Croatia for nearly a year, most Sarajevo residents who chose to join the demonstration were fairly certain that the war would not reach them. Not Sarajevo, not the city that had for centuries been known for its multiculturalism, for the coexistence of Bosniak Muslims, Catholic Croats, and Greek Orthodox Serbs, just to mention the 3 largest groups in Sarajevo. Surely the city, with its many well-educated young people, its universities and professors, its countless cafes where people discussed philosophy, religion, politics, and sports, could not be struck by war. Sarajevo's very identity was, to a large extent, built on the perception that it was a place of refined culture, or snobbery, as some critics called it. Surely the city that had hosted the Winter Olympics just 8 years earlier, opening its doors to the world, could not be drawn into the same war as Croatia. That happens to others, not to us. This was how Samir Koric and many of those who participated in the peace demonstration on April 5th, 1992, thought. They marched together, Sarajevans of all religions and nationalities, beneath Yugoslav flags, portraits of Tito, and handwritten signs calling for peace and coexistence. The enormous march, seemingly endless, stopped in front of the Parliament building. Several speeches were given before the crowd began moving again. This time, the masses turned right toward the Verbanja Bridge over the Miljacka River, heading toward the Grbavica district. A few blocks away, the Bosnian Serb party SDS, led by Radovan Karadzic, had taken up positions on the top floors of the tall, dirty, yellow Holiday Inn hotel. It was likely from here that the first shots were fired. Suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of gunfire and ricochets. At the same time, someone threw a hand grenade into the crowd. The demonstrators halted in the middle of the Verbanja Bridge. For a brief moment, there was an eerie stillness before panic set in. People began running in all directions, desperate to find safety. Left lying on the bridge was 21-year-old medical student Swada Dilberovic, struck by a bullet straight to the chest. She was rushed to a hospital but was pronounced dead upon arrival. Swada Dilberovic had marched against the war for peace and unity, and now she had become the first victim of the Bosnian War. The next day, on April 6, 1992, the EU recognized Bosnia and Herzegovina as an independent state, with the United States following suit the next day. Radovan Karadzic and the Bosnian Serb leadership had threatened open war if Bosnia was recognized. It was not an empty threat. Bosnian Serb snipers once again opened fire from the upper floors of the Holiday Inn, this time targeting demonstrators still gathered outside the Parliament building. 6 were killed, and dozens more were injured. The war in Bosnia had begun. The conflict would last more than 4 years and claim over 100,000 lives. More than 2 million people, over half the population, would be forced to flee. Those who joined the fighting in the former Yugoslavia were a diverse group. Some sought adventure, others simply wanted an outlet for their fascination with weapons, war, and killing. One of them was Jackie Arklov, raised in Storuman in the Lapland region of northern Sweden. He had been drawn to and fascinated by military life since his teenage years. When he went to fight in Bosnia, he brought with him a blue notebook in which he regularly wrote down his thoughts and reflections. Under the heading First Time, he described in detail the sensation of finally being able to kill. I aimed at the stomach area. He fell to the ground. I felt a hollow excitement within me, but he wasn't dead yet. My enemy began fumbling with his arms and emitted strangled cries. I then aimed at his spine and fired in bursts. He shook briefly, then lay still. At that very moment, a pain as sharp as an ice pick shot through my heart. Suddenly, I felt better than I had in months, perhaps years. Now I had killed for the first time. I felt like I wanted to keep going. I felt a sense of unreality inside me. In his early teens, Arklov became increasingly interested in National Socialism. He began reading articles and books about World War II, Nazism, the Jewish question, and the Holocaust. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, local groups of skinheads and organized far-right extremists had emerged across Sweden, including in the north. Jackie Arklov sought out the nearest Nazi group. For fairly obvious reasons, the members initially reacted with skepticism and outright rejection. A black Nazi was, in many ways, a contradiction. As had happened so many times before, Jackie Arklov was eventually accepted, but only conditionally. We decided he could be with us as long as he fought for our cause. He had the same views as us regarding Israel and the entire pro-Zionist movement. So we accepted him. We did, the group's leader later said, adding a caveat. But when we came to power, castration would be required for him. Yet for all the contradictions and conditional acceptance within the far-right movement, Arklov remained drawn to rigid structures, discipline, and a sense of purpose. He sought environments where strength and loyalty mattered more than heritage, where proving oneself in action could override ideology. That opportunity came with his military conscription. When he was conscripted, Arklov was accepted into the elite ranger training program at K4 in Arvidsjaur, a highly selective unit with particularly tough requirements for every young recruit. For perhaps the first time in his life, Arklov seemed satisfied. He later described his military service as the happiest period of his life. The training in Arvidsjaur is probably the thing I've been most successful at in life. That's why I wanted to continue as a soldier. The adventure and excitement drew me in, he later told his local newspaper. But soon, the problems returned. Despite his satisfaction, things didn't go as planned for Arklov. He struggled with the theoretical aspects and was transferred from the specialized anti-tank unit to a regular mortar group. Though he had good physical endurance and motivation, he was not considered to have the leadership qualities required for a military career. Instead of pursuing his dream of becoming a professional officer, Jackie Arklov found himself once again on the outside, looking in. Arklov decided to travel to Marseille to join the French Foreign Legion. But at the last moment, he changed his mind. Instead, his eyes turned to another battlefield, the war in Bosnia. This was just the beginning of a path that would eventually lead to one of Sweden's most infamous crimes, the Malexander murders. In Marseille, Arklov had overheard several people discussing the possibility of enlisting on the battlefields of the former Yugoslavia. The pay was not particularly high, but there were ample opportunities to fulfill his boyhood dream of war. In the autumn of 1992, Arklov traveled to Zagreb, Croatia, the side he had chosen in the war. He felt they were ideologically closest to his Nazi worldview. After a short time, in a unit composed mainly of other foreign volunteers, Arklov moved on. He joined one of the most notorious militia groups, the Ludwig Pavlovich unit, named after a fallen Croatian soldier. The Ludwig Pavlovich unit was one of many paramilitary groups, half legal, half illegal, that participated in the wars. They were often responsible for the worst atrocities and abuses, and the Pavlovich group was no exception. Their tasks included carrying out special operations, or liquidations, as Arklov himself called them in his diary. Some of those who fell victim to the unit's brutality were residents of small villages around the town of Stolac, attacked between July 12th and 15th, 1993. Alongside elements of the regular Croatian army, the unit advanced from village to village. In Aladinici, they burned down the mosque, and in Pjesivac Greda, they rounded up all the Muslim residents before looting their homes. One of the few who dared to speak out was 17-year-old Sanida Kaplan. "You've already taken the men, why are you taking us now?" she shouted at the soldiers. The response was a fatal shot to the chest. Sanida's body was left lying just outside her home's doorway. The rest of her family was taken away and interned in a makeshift prison camp inside a school, along with another 3,000 Bosniaks. Jackie Arklov later described the Ludwig Pavlovich unit's methods himself. In his diary entry from August 24, 1993, he wrote, "Attacked a Muslim village about 1 kilometer outside Mostar, took them by surprise, as we had sneaked in the night before and waited. The resistance was weak. We threw hand grenades through the windows, then stormed in and liquidated everything alive." Arklov thrived in his new life. "I have always wanted to experience war," he said years later in court. "When you're close to death, you truly feel alive." During a short leave home to Ankersund, Arklov took a reporter from the local newspaper into his childhood bedroom, proudly showing off fabric patches he had cut from the uniforms of slain soldiers and glued onto a framed board on his wall. "I keep them as souvenirs," he explained. He also showed the reporter a newspaper clipping featuring his unit's men kicking a man lying in the street. "Sure, they're fascists, but I didn't care," Arklov remarked, adding that no one liked Muslims, neither he nor anyone else in the former Yugoslavia. "They're like Jews, you can't trust them." But there were also days when even Arklov found it difficult. "A terrible stench of corpses hits us," he wrote in his diary on August 27, 1993. "Our colonel orders that all civilian bodies must be removed immediately. Burned or buried, a shitty job unlike any other. The stench seeps into the uniform, especially from half-burned corpses." When the men of the Ludwig Pavlovich unit were not carrying out special operations, they worked as prison guards or interrogators in various camps. According to several witnesses, Jackie Arklov stood out as particularly sadistic towards prisoners. During an interrogation of a Bosnian man named Muhammad Begovic at the military base in Grabovina, Arklov used a hose from a fire extinguisher with a metal nozzle at the end as a weapon against his victim. Arklov repeatedly struck Begovic on the arms, back, head, and chest with the heavy hose. After a while, he ordered Begovic to extend his hands, then beat them until the skin split and the bone was exposed. When Arklov still did not get the answers he wanted, He commanded Begovic to stick out his tongue, which he then beat until it burst, blood gushing from the torn flesh. For Arklov and the other men in his unit, terror, murder, and torture became an outlet for their aggression, he later admitted, in a conversation with Swedish ambassador to Sarajevo, Eric Pierre. We could sit around drinking beer and liquor, and suddenly someone would say, "Let's go beat up some Muslims." In the same conversation, Arklov revealed that his behavior also had an ideological foundation. Initially viewing Jews as the main problem, he gradually adopted the view that Muslims were the greatest threat to Europe. Many of his Croatian comrades shared this belief. They argued that swift and brutal action was necessary before Muslims took over entirely. Muslims were portrayed as monstrous. They were supposedly planning to establish a major Muslim center in Europe to spread Islamic fundamentalism. I believed them. The Croats were always friendly to me. They accepted me. On May 4, 1995, Jackie Arklov was captured by Bosnian military police in the city of Mostar after mistakenly straying into Bosnian-held territory. In September that year, he was convicted by a Bosnian court and sentenced to 13 years in prison for war crimes, including torture and assault. Just over a year later, on August 7, 1996, Arklov was released following interventions by the Swedish Embassy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as part of a prisoner exchange. Swedish UN soldiers immediately transported him to safety in Tuzla. The next day, he was flown back to Sweden aboard a Swedish Air Force Hercules plane. In Sweden, Arklov's case had become an unpleasant dilemma. What do you do with a person who has been sentenced to a lengthy prison term for serious war crimes but was released after barely a year? The answer was to prosecute him in Sweden as well. Upon landing at Arlanda Airport, Swedish police immediately arrested Arklov and took him to Kronoberg Remand Prison in central Stockholm. The next day, he was formally detained on suspicion of war crimes. A month later, on September 5, 1996, he was released as the prosecution deemed the evidence insufficient. 5 months after that, on January 29, 1997, his case was dropped entirely. Jackie Arklov was now not only a free man, he was also awarded compensation for the time he had spent in pre-trial detention. Arklov, who had been imprisoned in Bosnia for serious war crimes just months earlier, was now, as a free man in Sweden, able to cash in $4,000 in damages. One of the people reading the many newspaper articles about the Swedish Nazi who had fought in Bosnia was Tony Olsson. At the time, Olsson was locked up in Tidaholm prison, convicted of planning a contract killing of a mother of 5. Olsson had a long criminal history dating back to childhood. He had previously been convicted of shoplifting, theft, robbery, unlawful threats, vandalism, forgery, and weapons offences. During his various prison sentences, Olsson had come into contact with several Nazi sympathizers and had become a committed, ideologically driven Nazi himself. One of his biggest influences was former white Aryan resistance leader Christopher Rangner, whom he began corresponding with while Rangner was serving time at Kumla prison. Obviously, we cannot fight an inherently evil and violent regime with parliamentary methods. Guerrilla warfare is the path to victory, Rangner wrote in one of the 30-plus letters he sent Olsson. He emphasized the importance of military training and taking the struggle seriously. What we are engaged in is no child's play, it is deadly serious. In 1993, Tony Olsson joined the Nationalist Front. By age 21, he had quickly risen to become the regional leader in Örebro. In a 1995 interview for the nationalist magazine The Swedish National Socialist, Olsson shared his thoughts on the fight for the white race and the so-called Jewish World Government. ZOG, Zionist Occupation Government. The future looks very bright for me and for the struggle. I see no obstacle to us becoming a major political force within 5 years. What is required is our unwavering will to victory and the ability to take us there. We have the will, and we have the ability. The only problem is liquid assets. But with enough ambition, we will succeed in that as well. When asked about his role models, Olsen responded, "Adolf Hitler is, of course, my greatest role model. I draw a lot from him when I debate and argue. Also, fighters within our ranks who have proven themselves worthy to fight with us and against Zog are among my role models." What do you consider to be the greatest enemies of the national movement? Communism, internationalism, and of course, our greatest enemy, the Jew, the creator of all degeneration and cultural destruction. Now, Tony Olsen sat in his cell, growing increasingly intrigued as he read article after article about Jackie Arklov. He realized that this was exactly the kind of person he had been searching for. Together with another inmate, Mats Nilsson, Olsen had recently, inspired by his correspondence with Ragnar, founded a new militant Nazi combat group, NRA, the National Republican Army. Their military inspiration was IRA, the Irish Republican Army. The idea was to continue where white Aryan resistance had left off a few years earlier, but with a better structure and a stronger organization. Tony Olsen wrote a letter to the Swedish mercenary Jackie Arklov and sent it to him at Kronoberg Remand Prison. This became the start of an intense correspondence. In the letter, Tony Olsen offered Arklov membership in a new brotherhood. Here's the deal. There is an ongoing establishment of a militant National Socialist organization with the intention of operating nationwide. Its primary goal is to overthrow today's parliamentary system by legal and illegal means, Olsen wrote. He suggested that Arklov, with his military background and experience, should join the upcoming fight. This is a struggle worth sacrificing one's life for. With truth as our weapon and a strong conviction, half the battle is won. With the resources at our disposal, we will create a movement that is both stronger and more effective than what VAM ever was or could have become. Arklov accepted the offer. For Arklov, war had been a perfect outlet for his darkest instincts. But when the battlefield disappeared, he simply found a new one, Sweden. Together with Tony Olsen and two other men from the Nazi terror group, Arklov embarked on a series of bank robberies in the autumn of 1998, a first step in building the financial foundation for the race war they planned to wage. Arklov did not participate in the first robbery, which targeted an ICA store in Trollhättan on November 1st, but 2 days later, he received an enthusiastic letter from Tony Olsen. "I can proudly report that the struggle has begun." Despite being officially incarcerated, Tony Olsen and the other men in the group had no difficulty getting out to launch their campaign for white supremacy. They were all part of a high-profile theatre project led by the playwright Lars Norén. After receiving a letter from Tony Olsen, Norén had enthusiastically involved the prisoners in a production about life as a Nazi, casting real Nazis in the leading roles. The Swedish Prison and Probation Service granted Olsen and the others generous furloughs to rehearse with Norén for a few hours. The rest of their time in freedom, however, was spent planning and executing bank robberies, funding the race war they were preparing for. How were they able to manage this without getting caught? Well, your guess is as good as mine, to be honest. For over half a year, a spree of violent bank robberies swept across Sweden. The police were paralyzed by the robbers' brutality and ruthlessness, fearing what might happen if a confrontation occurred. Ultimately, that confrontation would come on May 28, 1999. Two police officers began pursuing 3 bank robbers after a heist at a bank in Kisa. At 4:10 p.m., radio contact with the 2 officers was lost. When reinforcements arrived at the scene, they found the 2 officers lying next to their patrol car. They had been executed with their own service weapons. These murders would soon be known to the world as the Malexander murders. 2 of the bank robbers are you well acquainted with at this point. Our third robber, however, was a young man by the name Andreas Axelsson. He was the youngest and least experienced of the trio, and was drawn into the group through his association with Olsen. Although he played a more supporting role, Axelsson was fully complicit in their crimes. Together they formed a deadly alliance, blending far-right ideology with a willingness to commit heinous acts for financial gain. Their crimes would culminate in a devastating confrontation that forever marked the small village of Malexander. At 2:50 p.m. on May 28th, Andreas Axelsson and Jackie Arklov, wearing balaclavas, entered Östgöta Enskilda Bank in Kisa. Armed with pistols and hand grenades, they yelled at customers and staff to lie down and not touch the alarms. To hinder identification, they sprayed all the security cameras with black paint except for one. Outside, Tony Olsson stood guard with a submachine gun and wearing a balaclava. Arklov was the first to enter the bank, followed by Axelsson, who kicked open a door leading to the cash registers. When they demanded the vault be opened, a cashier informed them that it was locked by a time delay. Axelsson checked his watch and saw that 12 minutes remained. Deciding to wait, the robbers moved through the bank, emptying the cash registers. When the vault finally opened, they took the money and warned the customers to stay down, threatening to return if anyone moved. At 3:10 p.m., the robbers left the bank with a total of 2,615,900 Swedish krona, equivalent to around $305,882 at the time. Adjusted for inflation and current exchange rates, this amount would be worth approximately $511,869 today. After they left, they fled in a stolen Saab 9000. Axelsson drove the getaway car with Olsson in the passenger seat and Arklov in the back. Kenneth Eklund, the local police chief of Kinda, was the only officer on duty that day. When the bank's panic alarm was activated, the communications center contacted Eklund and asked him to investigate without engaging directly. He donned his protective vest, got into his patrol car, and drove the short distance from the police station to the bank. Taking up a position further down the street, he observed the situation as the robbers waited for the time-locked vault to open. "I had a bit of a pulse, to say the least," Eklund later recalled. Bystanders approached him, shouting that a robbery was underway. "I thought, of course I know, just get out of here," he said. When the robbers finally exited the bank, they jumped into a getaway car with weapons pointed out the windows. Eklund began to follow them. "We were going at approximately 140 kilometers per hour, so not too bad," he noted. However, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if they stop somewhere and start shooting at me? A short time later, that is exactly what happened. On a straight stretch south of Kisa, the robbers exited their vehicle and opened fire. Eklund slammed on the brakes about 150 meters away. They gave what you'd call kneeling fire in military terms. Very professional, he said. Despite the hail of bullets, the police car was not hit, and the robbers got back into their car and continued their flight. Eklund resumed the pursuit. Further down the road, the robbers stopped again, this time in a more strategic location. "As I came around a curve, and there they were in the middle of the road," Eklund said. He braked hard, stopping just 25 meters from the robbers. They opened fire, and when he tried to reverse, he discovered his car was completely disabled. The car was dead. It was pitch black inside, he explained. Eklund ducked toward the passenger seat to avoid being shot through the windshield. After a moment, the gunfire ceased. Thinking the robbers had left, he looked up, only to see all three walking toward him. "I threw myself out of the car," he said. Automatic gunfire cracked behind him as he sprinted toward a nearby marsh. "I knew I was going to die," Eklund later admitted. "I thought I would black out at any moment." A witness later reported seeing a grenade land directly behind Eklund as he ran. He didn't notice it at the time, but moments later, the grenade detonated with a deafening explosion. "The whole marsh shook," Eklund said. Then he heard one of the robbers shout, "The cop is lying in the reeds." Certain he would be found, Eklund prepared his service weapon for the first time that day. "I thought, come on, I have 16 rounds in the magazine and 16 in reserve to offer," he recalled. However, the robbers got back into their car and continued their escape. Eklund survived the harrowing encounter, but the robbers were on a collision course with the police officers Robert Karlström, and Ola Borén in Malexander, where events would take an even darker turn. At 3:18 p.m., the robbers switched their getaway vehicle to a Toyota Avensis. Two of them lay hidden on the floor of the car to avoid detection. Despite this, the new car was spotted by police, and the pursuit continued. At 4:08 p.m., near Sommerhagen, just north of Malexander, a police vehicle began following the robbers closely, maintaining a distance of only 2 to 3 meters. The robbers' vehicle eventually stopped in a curve near a small lake in Malexander. The confrontation escalated when Olsen opened fire directly at the police vehicle's windshield, shattering it. The two officers, Ola Borén and Robert Karlström, took cover behind their car doors as both vehicles came to a halt. Despite their attempts to defend themselves, the officers were outgunned. At 4:10 p.m., radio contact with Borén and Karlström was lost. The last sound heard was screaming over the radio. Both officers were found murdered at the scene. Borén had been shot 5 times, including a fatal execution-style shot to the neck. Karlström had been hit by 3 bullets, one of which was a close-range shot to the forehead, fired from a distance of just 10 centimeters, according to forensic analysis. Both officers were executed with their own service weapons. The brutality of the murders and the calculated execution-style killings shocked the nation. A memorial service for the slain officers was later held in Mjölby, attended by the National Police Commissioner and other dignitaries. Following the brutal execution-style murders of police officers Ola Borén and Robert Karlström, Swedish authorities launched one of the most intense manhunts in the nation's history. The public was horrified by the nature of the crime, and law enforcement mobilized every available resource to track down the suspects: Tony Olsen, Andreas Axelsson, and Jackie Arklov. With the killers armed, dangerous, and on the run, their capture became a top national priority. Andreas Axelsson, the first to be apprehended, had been injured during the shootout in Malexander. Wounded and unable to continue on the run, Axelsson sought medical attention at a small clinic in Boxholm shortly after the murders. His injuries, including gunshot wounds consistent with the firefight, raised immediate suspicion among the medical staff. The staff contacted the police, who quickly arrived and arrested Axelsson on the spot. At the time of his arrest, he provided no plausible explanation for his injuries, and forensic evidence soon confirmed his involvement in the crimes. Axelsson's capture provided investigators with critical information about the other suspects' identities and movements. Jackie Arklov, the most ideologically extreme of the trio, evaded capture for several days, traveling across the country in an attempt to stay ahead of the authorities. On May 31st, 1999, 3 days after the murders, police apprehended him in Tyresö, near Stockholm. During the arrest, Arklov was shot by the police and sustained a shot to a lung, but despite his injury, he was taken into custody and provided with necessary medical care. At the time of his arrest, he was found in possession of items linking him to the robbery and murders. Initially, Arklov denied involvement in the crimes, but subsequent investigations and his own later admissions confirmed his central role in the events, including the execution of the officers. Tony Olsen, the de facto leader of the group, proved the most elusive. Using forged documents, and likely with the assistance of his fiancée, Olsen managed to flee Sweden entirely in the days following the murders. He traveled to Costa Rica, attempting to disappear in a foreign country far from the reach of Swedish law enforcement. However, his escape was short-lived. Swedish authorities, working in collaboration with Interpol and local law enforcement, traced Olsen to a hotel in Costa Rica. On June 6th, just over a week after the murders, Olsen was arrested. At the time of his capture, he was found with approximately $146,000 from the bank robbery in Kisa, further solidifying the case against him. His arrest marked the end of a dramatic international pursuit, and he was extradited to Sweden a few weeks later to face trial. The rapid apprehension of all three suspects was a testament to the effectiveness of Swedish law enforcement and international cooperation. It also reflected the intense pressure to bring the killers to justice, given the brutality of their crimes. The Linköping District Court indicted the three men on October 26, 1999. All three were sentenced to life imprisonment. Axelsson and Olsson on January 18th, and Arklov on February 2nd, 2000. The sentences were upheld by the Svea Court of Appeal. Olsson and Axelsson admitted to the bank robbery and acknowledged their presence at Malexander, but denied committing the murders. Olsson claimed that Arklov alone killed the policeman, a confession Arklov made in June 2001, stating he used the officers' own weapons to execute them at point-blank range, consistent with forensic findings. Despite this, the verdicts for Axelsson and Olsson remained unchanged. The life sentence for Axelsson was particularly debated, as Sweden lacks a felony murder rule. Sentencing someone who did not commit the fatal shootings to life imprisonment was considered harsh by some. The lives of Tony Olsson, Jackie Arklov, and Andreas Axelsson continued to attract public and media attention long after their convictions, each taking a different trajectory but remaining entwined in the legacy of the Malexander murders. Tony Olsson, who changed his name to Tony Bystrom during his imprisonment, continued to demonstrate a troubling defiance. On the night of July 27th to 28th, 2004, while confined to Hall Prison, Olsson staged an escape that involved cutting through prison bars and scaling a wall. His freedom was short-lived. He was recaptured 2 days later, further cementing his reputation as a high-risk offender. Over time, Olsson claimed to have distanced himself from his extremist past, but public skepticism about the sincerity of his transformation persisted. On November 27, 2019, his life sentence was commuted to a fixed term of 35 years and was conditionally released on September 2, 2023. Andreas Axelsson maintained a lower profile during his incarceration. Like Olsson, Axelsson's life sentence was commuted to 35 years in 2022 and was released on September 21, 2022, after serving 2/3 of his sentence. Axelsson's involvement in the crime, while significant, was often viewed as less direct than that of his co-defendants, though this distinction did little to diminish the gravity of his actions in the eyes of the public. Jackie Arklov underwent a psychiatric evaluation shortly after his conviction. The evaluation revealed troubling psychological patterns shaped by his past as a mercenary in the Yugoslav wars. Years later, after the Malexander murders, Arklov defended his National Socialist convictions during police interrogations. It's a healthy ideology compared to today's decadent ideologies. It's based on the survival of the strongest. It's based on a healthy society, a pure society. National Socialism is almost like a religion, and a political ideology without spirituality is doomed to fail. In September 2020, Arklov once again applied for a fixed-term sentence. Örebro District Court denied the request, citing the risk of Arklov reoffending in serious crimes. In June 2023, Örebro District Court set his sentence at 41 years. The ruling was appealed, and in January 2024, Göta Court of Appeal decided not to impose a fixed-term sentence for Arklov. Arklov appealed the Court of Appeal's ruling to the Supreme Court, which in April 2024 decided not to grant leave to appeal. Thus, the Court of Appeal's ruling remains in effect. Jackie Arklov's path from an idealistic young soldier to a brutal war criminal, and then to one of Sweden's most infamous murderers, is a chilling reminder of how easily violence breeds more violence. For him, Bosnia was an opportunity to kill, to belong, to justify his darkest urges. And when the war was over, when he returned to Sweden, he did not leave that darkness behind. Violence does not stay on the battlefield. Hate does not die with one war. It moves, it spreads, and if we are not vigilant, it finds a new home. Thank you for watching the Midnight Docket. If you found this case compelling, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. The docket is never closed. See you when the next case unfolds.